Good morning and welcome to Mina Loy's retrospective, which has been a long time in coming. I liked last night that Roger actually gave us some dates to hang our hat on, but it is a good long time. What was it, 64 years since her last show. Our secret weapon today in this talk is I only have 45 minutes to get you through the show. Yesterday we convened some of the scholars who were here this morning, and we stood over there for 45 minutes and did not get anywhere else. So the charge is to move forward, but I think that their presence here today, people who know far more about Mina than I do, I'm a new interloper, an enthusiast, you'll be able to tell, is that their responses to seeing this work, which no one has seen exhibited together ever except for Roger, is transformative to the scholarship on her life and to the definition of an artist in the 20th century. So Mina, unusually, as you may know, some of you may know her as a poet, but guess what? It turned out all those years she was making art. Day in and day out, and actually felt herself to be an artist. And so trying to understand in the creative process and how we look at creators and how they define themselves is basically catalyzed by considering Mina's life and the trajectories of the creative spirit. So she said in her life that one led into the other, always both at the same time, the word and the image. But we know in her practice that took a lot of roller coaster rides through a lot of different forms of art making. So we have her drawings, her early work here. We have her inventions in the next room. We have her working for 10 years in Paris as a designer of industrial lights and lampshades. She was a fashion designer, hats and dresses. Alas, many of these things no longer exist. So we can't complete that image. We hope that the exhibition and its accompanying publication will draw out of private collections some of that work. In addition to the bodies of work that you see here, she completed an entire other body of paintings made of cut paper that were bouquets of flowers. They all sold out of her 2 exhibitions in New York. Not a one of them do we know where it is. Be pretty exciting to find one. We also don't have our hands on any of the lampshades, although I was joking to Roger last night. We know that the Mountbatten family purchased 10 of them. So could there in fact be one sailing ship lampshade on the coast of England somewhere? We can only hope that maybe they will be spurred to share that with us. So Mina Loy, she was born in 1882 in Britain, in London, and she died in 1966 in Aspen, Colorado. And the arc of her life took her to many centers of creative making in a very tumultuous time in the history of Europe and America. She grew up in London, and she had a natural facility to drawing. So you'll see in the early case, she grew up in a generally conservative household. I don't want to belabor biography. I think you can read that in the catalog. I think Roger ably touched on it last night. But just to say that her creative energies were recognized by her father, who was a haberdasher, a successful one. So while he was an immigrant from a very well-off Jewish Hungarian family, he came to England and had success, and his work was recognized for its fineness, and he did very well for them. And in terms of the family, I would say upper middle class. And he did have the power to send Mina away to art school. She was not settling well into a quiet Victorian household. And as you read her biography, you certainly will know why. She was a smart aleck from a very young age. She was very perceptive about the sort of false limits that Victorian life posed to her as a woman, and she was never going to concede to those conventions. So her dad shuffled her off to Munich first. She then came home after that art education, back to the household. It was so awkward. She and her mother really did not get on. Her mother was a sort of fearful middle-class person trying to adhere closely to convention, to be positioned in society, and Mina wasn't going to do that. So her dad then enabled her to go to school in Paris. And that was in her early 20s. She, again, very soon in art school, married a man named Stephen Heuss, who was her fellow art student. The long story short, that was an unhappy marriage. She had then a very brief and happy marriage to Arthur Craven for just less than a year, the great love of her life. And she had a series of sort of fascinating amores who were important to her, and I will reference them as we go. The pinions of the exhibition, her early work in Paris and in Florence, she had available to her the images of a woman's life. So women became her primary subjects, along with herself. At the entrance to the gallery is a very moving self-portrait that she drew shortly after the death of her first child, her daughter Oda, and it was Stephen Heuss's child, died within a year and it was devastating to her as a young mother. And so that image of her staring into a mirror, the pencil graphite drawing right by the door, is actually a kind of, I think, touchstone to the rest of her life. Many of her friends said while she was always very engaged with in repartee and in creative process with her colleagues in literary and artistic circles, she always had a remove, a kind of sober remove. And Natalie Barney, Mina was a member of her literary salon in Paris, said she walked as though angels were always nipping at her heels. And I think her orientation, life dealt her a lot of sobering realities, and she didn't just move through them, she absorbed them and processed them. So it made her a somber and considered observer of the world around her. And it gave her, long-term in her life, a lot of compassion. So the subjects that come later in her life, she, in Florence, is depicting here, and you'll see in some of the cases, some drawings of peasant women and their children, of young girls and their arc into maturity as women. That later becomes her observation of her neighbors on the Bowery, people who she called the refugees of the world. She considered herself refused from the conventions of society and much more at home in her celestial and soulful life. And she had a direct compassion and drive to represent them, to make them present in the world in her work. In this talk, since we are here in the gallery with the artwork, this is a very special opportunity. I would like to say, please interrupt with a question. If you have that question, probably like 3 other people in the room have the question, and this is your time to get it answered well. So it may or may not be answered in the catalog. And again, all of us are going to be inspired by looking closely at a work that's here. Pencil, paper, watercolor, these are the immediate materials available to her. She's trained classically at Colarossi. Unusually there, as a student, they were able to study sculptural forms as a woman. And this plays out, we were talking yesterday, some of the scholars, very beautifully. We only know of one extant sculpture that she made in her life. It's the Madonna and Child, which we only have an image of in that case there. But you should definitely observe, as you move through the show, Mina's movements as a creator from 2 dimensions to 3 dimensions. And I really encourage you, when you look at the last, almost the last work on this wall, it's called Communal Cot, that you'll see with the same pieces of paper and little bits of material, she actually is able to create full bodies and expression in the sleeping forms of the street people that are in that particular work. It's sort of an extraordinary accomplishment. So something like that for an artist happens over much practicing, right? You're honing and honing. I like to say Degas is a really great example. So Degas, we love his paintings, but for him, he kept privately for himself in his life sculptures, which were really not shared with the world till after his death. And he actually created anatomical horses with cork and wire so that he could figure out how their bodies actually circumlocuted, so that by the time he went to make those sculptures in bronze, they were cast, and then also in his paintings, he knew how the anatomy worked because he had played with it over and over again in the actual how an object moves in space. So I think we're seeing that with Mina, that over her life, she's again closely looking at how people articulate themselves. She closely studied people's faces and hands. And this was to the point where she invented something called autofacial construction in 1919 in Italy. It was to advise people to manage their visage, their facial physiognomy, because it could define them as a person in the world. And it's a manifesto about that. She thought she could market it, actually, which she was not able to. But that is, again, her close observation of people is how she's understanding humanity and then internalizing people's trajectory in life. Biography, let's see, so she she gets pregnant by a friend in Paris. Her husband and she go to Florence. You can read about their relationship, not so important to the art, although she did do a really sort of arch drawing of her first husband. It's in the case over there. They go to Florence. She has 2 children subsequently, another daughter, Joella, and a son, and Giles. And she is sort of feels isolated. She had achieved very good recognition at the Salon in Paris. She had gotten great critical response to her early work, but then she was removed because of these familial obligations and her husband to Florence. So she sort of had to start all over again, and that took like 4 years in her life. But she then connected with the American heiress Mabel Dodge, who brought life to her and belief and vision. And then she subsequently met probably the 2 most influential people in her creative life. That was Gertrude Stein and Filippo Tommaso. Yes, so Carl van Vechten, and Marinetti, the futurist. And so Marinetti, while that relationship amorously was less than satisfying, he actually recognized her as a creative person and really compelled her to her individuality and helped her think of herself as an avant-garde, that she didn't have to actually just respond to the world around her, but she could create a world as an artist. And she took that up first in language, and we were discussing this yesterday with the literary scholars here. So Mina spoke 4 languages, so English, German, French, and Italian. She wasn't professionally trained and educated in any of them, and she was known to great elisions of those languages. I don't know if any of you have ever studied a foreign language, but if you have, if you've gone somewhere and lived in a foreign country, and then you come back to English, for an extremely long time, all that syntax and grammar flips your use of vocabulary. Things jump into your mind in the other language, and it all becomes kind of jumbled. So that was actually Mina's front page in terms of her thinking about words and letters and expression. And so encountering the futurists' sort of riotous, rebellious, and declarative use of language was just a perfect match. And she used that to write her aphorisms on futurism, which appeared in Camera Work in New York in 1914. And she decided to declare her outrage at her life as a woman, at the kind of mistreatment and unfairness of the world, and she was fired. And she was radical. And so she became, even before getting there, embraced by the American literary avant-garde. She was considered most radical poet. Ezra Pound thought that, wrote that, there's nobody but you and Marianne Moore. I'm a little depressed. Where's everybody else? We're ready. What's going on? Mina, anyway, it's just too long a biography. We're not getting out of this room. All right. So just to say that she then left Florence, went to New York for a brief period of time. It is where she met Arthur Craven, and that trajectory led her to Mexico. They got married. They conceived a child. She went back to England by herself because he disappeared in her life. He was her great intellectual and artistic paramour, an emotional paramour for her entire life. He appears in her literary work to the end of her life. She in the case is a novel, Colossus, that she began. Widow's Jazz is a poem she wrote in the perpetual mourning of the loss of that intellectual and artistic companion that she never found a partner to that again in her life. But she kept rolling. So even as she is absorbing these losses in her life, she then lost her son. Stephen Hoyce came, took her son he moved to a Caribbean island, and the son got cancer, and Mina never saw him again. So she had lost 2 children. She lost her partner in life, but she, gosh, I gotta make it brief. She moves from being in New York with the avant-garde. They embrace her. She not only she opens a lampshade shop. She's a very industrious gal, always practical about making a little money. But she saw industrial design and decorative arts as a very full expression of her art and her creative powers. She fell in with the Ahrensburg collection, set, ate their hors d'oeuvres, and met what I think is her great cohort in life, from Marcel Duchamp, Joseph Stella, the entire crew at the Ahrensburg. She was with them there for a year. She was early contributor to the Blind Man, which you have here at Bowdoin in your collection and is here in the case. And she began to write plays. She was an actress. You'll see here she was a performer. Question?
I wanted to ask you about her means. Because
financially?
Yes, because if she was a woman of means, she would have been able to take care of her children.
She did.
What she wanted, but if she's not from means, then she has to do maybe women's work,
right,
to go into decorative arts and support herself. So Mabel is not supporting her. The Ahrensburgs are not supporting her in the traditional patronage sense.
Well, Mabel bought her work. Mabel owned her work, and she was.
Sponsored by Peggy Guggenheim.
Yes, she was sponsored by Peggy Guggenheim when she gets to Paris. Peggy helps her sell her work. I think, I don't believe that Mina felt it was a lesser thing to make marketable goods. Okay. I think that, she was a happy capitalist. Okay. And interesting, I'm just thinking of it at this moment. Well, her father made clothes, and that was a very effective way for him to support his family. He was successful and creative in that work. And so that's a precedent for her in her personal life. There are records. So she received a stipend from her father into her 40s until his death. So when Mina travels off to New York and then back to New York, she leaves the children for a period of around 8 years with a nanny. And she has an Italian nanny who takes care of her children. So yes, she is poor. She is not as poor as many other members of the avant-garde. And we know that even at the end, when she comes to New York after the onset of World War II, after the Depression, she gives up her lampshade shop, which is, we're gonna move this way, because we're never gonna get to the other side of the room. And when you see things, you can ask questions. So this is the most impoverished time in her life, I think. And World War II has devastated the resources of the French. It's after the Depression. She ultimately had bought a very nice apartment. So during the period where she's financially supporting herself with the lampshade shop, she receives the one moment in her life where she is her own agent in all things. She achieves that goal of autonomy as a woman, and her daughter Joella helps her run that store. By 1930, she's closing that enterprise. Her daughter Joella married Julian Levy, the famous New York art dealer. And Joella was really like the bookkeeper and the tax. Mina was the creative, and it never really stayed solid after Joella left for New York. So by 1930, she's given up the shop. And she works for Julian Levy as an agent, bringing the surrealists, we'll get into the other room sometime, into New York. She's the one who's going to their studios. She's telling Julian who he should go see. She meets Salvador Dali. She's gleaning the best of the avant-garde in Paris for Julian to show in New York. She does that, and that's a happy job for her. For 6 years, it enables her to get back to being a visual artist. It's the time period which she develops the body of work that's in the next room. She writes a novel, a surrealist novel called Insel, which is in the last case in the other room. She's also, again, back to writing plays. She is an entirely creative being all the time. They are impoverished. She's living with her younger daughter, Fabi, in Paris. And this video, I had seen part of it at Roger's house, but I hadn't seen, so that dog right there, I have a dog, so I'm very sympathetic. Toto was a gift to Fabi, her daughter. She's very close friends with Constantine Brancusi, and that's a puppy from his dog. And at this time, they have to give the dog away because they cannot feed it. And Mina actually sends Fabi to live with a farm family so she can be fed properly. Mina's not able to do that for her in Paris. And then she finally decides she has to move to New York. So she very reluctantly for so long gave up this life that she loved. You know, she and Man Ray would sort of sit at the cafes in Paris while the Nazis were bombing France and sit there and, you know, it's like, what do? You're not going anywhere, so you might as well hope you don't get hit. But then her family said, Joella said, you've got to leave, you've got to come, and they figured out a way to finance that. When they moved to New York, there's a letter that says she's still getting $40 a month from her mother. She and her mother did not get along, but she still was a good Victorian mother, which was enough to cover her and Fabi's rent in New York, but nothing else. So she again had this supplement, but never enough. I do feel she had this kind of dread because she grew up in such a confined and supported economic circumstance as a child. She always dreaded the fear of poverty as much as resisting the effects of it. We know that when she was in New York, she and Fabi lived very hand to mouth. I think it was a part of the world at that moment, right? The avant-garde, many artists killed themselves in that period because they were so poor. And it was pervasive in the world. I think the video is also really like a very good insight into society at this time. While it's black and white, of course it has a certain tone, but I think in the poor people that are in that you see that the world had a different luster for people then. It was difficult to make ends meet. So she had some money. Her daughters made sure she was cared for. So in the next gallery, there's an accounting of Mina's expenses. I love Mina. She never let her life break her on the accounting there. She's buying red patent leather shoes, red satin underwear, and she's paint in big, bold letters. So Mina was there all the time, even as she struggled with the changes in her life and struggled with the depression that came upon her. Her spirit was resolute, and she always rose up till the very end. Where are we now? Okay, Paris. Phenomenal success with the shop with Peggy Guggenheim. All of that's here in this case. The one really lovely piece that came from me, I think the most exciting, there are two most exciting things to me as a nerdy scholar in this show. One was going to visit Fabi's daughter in New Mexico, and they brought out a little portfolio of things. And in this little portfolio, there's a drawing of Fabi here. They gave us those two very early pieces that are in the first case, Juvenalia piece by Mina and another later drawing. But the cutout of the woman here is a simple cutout. So paper was just a natural medium for Mina all her life. And one could look at this and be like, oh, that's so nice. It's a lady in one of the dresses that she designed. But if you look closely at the photograph of her and Peggy Guggenheim, this is like too late in the night that your brain says, oh my gosh. There is, in fact, a figure like this on one of the lampshades. She made it to decorate one of her lampshades, so it's the only extant connection to this whole body of work that we have. So that makes me excited. We see the color, we see the attention to detail, we see the scale, all of those things very interesting. The other remarkable group of work, so any questions about this period?
Jennifer, thank you so much. I'd just like to make an observation about your wonderful find of that beautiful cutout figure, which appears in the lampshade with Peggy Guggenheim. Because in a way, I think what it does is to point up some really interesting threads of continuity. Mina's interest in women and their garments. But another thing, speaking of her father's work as a tailor, that tickles me is that when Mina went to the Blind Man's Ball in New York during her first trip there, where she meets Duchamp and other members of the American European avant-garde, transatlantic avant-garde, she's actually wearing a costume in which she is dressed as a lampshade, which I just find totally delightful. So what's fun is that in some ways on the surface, where we see aspects of her career that might seem superficially a little bit discontinuous. What I love about the show is that as we take a deep dive, we begin to realize that there are these glimpses already at the very beginning of her career of threads that are going to continue throughout. And I feel like that little final extant piece of a lampshade just tells us so much about these larger interests in her career.
So yeah, no, absolutely. And even in the show, so that the early clothing, like you said, it's just a continuous theme. We know that she designed all her own clothes and the clothes for her daughters. In the case here is a review of hats that she was designing and being recognized for in New York when she was there for like, what, a year and a half in the 20s. She wasn't even there very long, but she managed to already get herself in the newspaper for them. She designed clothing for her friends. She sent the drawing on the wall there of the 5 costumes with the drop waist. So there is Carolyn Burke says that Heuss recognized that he thinks that she influenced Paul Poiret in Paris for the drop waist fashion. What we all have said, the scholars here, is we really need to get a fashion scholar in here to tell us what time frames these things were happening and how she was influenced. She sent many drawings of dresses she designed to New York with Carl Van Vechten, and was not able to get them marketed. And also magazine covers. So she's trying all the time, all these different ways to express her creative capacities. Let's go to the next gallery. Here's just some nice photographs of her in her midlife. You'll see that these images of her are similar to how she's looking in Paris. She dallies with the surrealists. So she's working in Paris. She is this agent and gets to know them. And she is, throughout her life, sorry, I skipped something in Florence. So her daughter Joella almost dies. We don't know whether maybe it was considered polio, very, very sick. And she goes to a Christian Science healer, and her daughter is miraculously healed. Mina becomes an adherent of Christian Scientism, which she then adapts into her own faith journey. And she very much believes that her work as an artist is a divine calling, that her work is in fact to address the, what shall we say, the imperfection of humanity and the world, that she can make a stake for beautiful, for healing, and for redemptive work in her art. This sets her a little aside from the modernists, who actually are much more devoutly addressing humanism, but it's actually the driver for her work throughout her life. And even as she goes to New York, it becomes more and more of a priority for her and is enriched by her relationship with Joseph Cornell, who is also a Christian Scientist. So in this area here, we have an extraordinary accomplishment thanks to Roger Conover and Marie de Filippitano, who preserved a very high percentage of the exhibition that Mina had at Julian Levy Gallery in 1933. So when she gives up the shop and is an agent, she begins to paint again more. And she, one of the things I haven't even spoken to, so for me, process is very important for me in how I understand our artist. So her moves in terms of the medium, how she's managed at creating images is of great interest to me. And in this particular body of work, she mixes sand and ground glass to create paintings that have an inner evanescence. And they actually glow. Because of the drawings that are here from the Philadelphia Museum of Art, we have to keep the lighting low so that we don't damage those. But if you were to, are they allowed to put their cell phone light on these paintings?
I think you should ask the lenders how they feel about that.
Is that possible? Okay, Roger says yes. Okay, so if you were to take your cell phone light and go up to this painting, you will see the glitter. So when they are lit, like in daylight, the paintings glow. So Julian, for years, tried to get Mina to give him an exhibition. She was reluctant to do it. And finally, he goes to Paris, and she's got this body of work moving along. She's done these drawings. She's moving away from this detailed representation that you see here towards these other figures that are more mythical and iconic, archetypal. I would say my reading of them, while you can see the influences of classic Greek statuary, they are utterly other. The moon faces come from, I believe, from tarot cards that were being very avidly used by the avant-garde during this time period. There's a picture of one of them in the catalog. But she moves to making this image that's utterly other for her. So a case that we just totally skipped over there is a group of the modernists that she sort of embraced and trained herself on. So she was very close to Gertrude Stein, Wyndham Lewis, who was British. She met when she was a student at Colarossi. He goes on to define the futurist movement in England in defiance of Marinetti, which Mina just loved. And he was also a playwright, a writer, a poet, and she respected him. So we know she goes to London in 1912 and sees the great post-impressionist exhibition is there, which brought together the British avant-garde with people like Picasso and Matisse. And she writes to Mabel Dodge that the only person she respected in the whole lot of them was Lewis, that he had an integrity and an originality that she admired. And it pushed her herself. She writes a poem in response, which you'll see in that gallery, to a drawing of his that she is reproduced in a magazine. Was it camera work or was it, I'm not sure, Dial?
Little Review.
Little Review, okay, thanks, Roger. And she digs in deep. So when she writes the poetry, she's musing on the work. She does this with Brancusi's Golden Bird, which passing through Paris, she sees in a private collection, and is just transformed by the purity of this expression, how radical it was, and how could she connect with this? Someone an artist who has this remarkable ability for attention to detail and observation, which I'm delighted to say, when you look at the last works of her life, she went back to. She understood she didn't have to give that up to be avant-garde. She understood that being an avant-garde was about her spirit, the expression of emotional, intellectual, and spiritual aspiration. And so she's not limiting herself to that of what her colleagues, the people she respected the most. She also is transformed by James Joyce Ulysses. She's in a group in Paris with him. All of these things she's absorbing and then moving herself forward. So she finally reaches the point in her art that she's already achieved literarily, where she can actually create something entirely new. And this body of work is that. So here we have 80% or 90% of that exhibition here. We know that it was shown in New York. All of these works were presented in white frames. But before the exhibition, in order to get her to agree to the show, Julian takes this painting and another painting to New York with him. And he has this, he convinces Chick Austin to show it in a show at Wadsworth Atheneum to introduce Mina's paintings. She then has the show in New York. It's the exhibition that Joseph Cornell was transformed by absolutely in his life. You'll read the letter here in the case that speaks to that. It continued her show, changed him for the next 12 years radically in his work. He said he could never get over the kind of celestial aspiration, and he knew he had to meet her because she was the only other artist, in defiance of the Surrealists, who they together snidely would call the Black Magicians, when they became friends, who was trying to do something that was not about being sensational. They didn't want to be sensational, they wanted to be earnest in their creativity. So she makes this show. Only one painting sells. It's sold to a woman collector in Philadelphia. We cannot find that painting, sadly. The woman's collection went to PMA, but not this painting. And so she then is in the studio, and Julian Levy and she had a wonderful repartee. There was great love. He believed in her as a creative artist, in addition to having her as mother-in-law. She was a mother-in-law in the sort of, what we say, the conventional sense. She was a challenging mother-in-law and an enchanting one. He was deeply in love with her throughout her life and was committed to her, and actually was involved in helping realize the Bodley show at the end of her life. But he's begging her to actually be the artist he knows she can be. And they have the show, but it didn't sell. And then Julian made a mistake. You should never tell an artist that another artist made really great work and it sold very well. And could you make work similar to their work? So he does that. In a letter, he says, Mina, you're such a great artist, but you know, Florian Stettheimer just had this exhibition of these like Fabrique and delicate and candy-colored paintings, and they all sold. So if you could make a body of work like that, that would be so great. And not only that, but did you know that Florian Stettheimer just did a very successful theater project with Gertrude Stein? Okay, total killer. You don't tell someone that their best friend played in somebody else's sandbox. And so Mina makes these paintings in response to Julian's request. A body of the darkest paintings of her life. I personally find it, in other interpretations, and other people can have other readings, I'd love to hear from anyone else in the room, but just to tittle his request for something saccharine. There's little things that I read are like as bunnies and fairies and butterflies, just to say, oh, you wanted cute? I'll give you cute. I'll give you cute in Hades. And that's the body of work she made. In the catalog, you can see a whole suite of representations. So she makes these paintings in Paris. They are photographed, which is amazing. So the Beinecke Library has photographs of this whole other body of work. It's all we have of them. We hope again from this exhibition that people will come forward to say, I've got it. And again, they're generally smaller scale, very dark. And so it was her, don't tell me what I should be as an artist answer. So from there, Mina eventually comes to New York, and as we discussed earlier, she is in need of an economy. And when she had the lamp shop in Paris, she, and it was lamps, shades, and I don't know if any of you know, 1925 was the great art decoration fest in Paris. It was an incredible exposition. It was phenomenal. And people came from around the world to Paris to look at the decorative arts. And Mina was living in that revelry. And so she did very well, sold to the Mountbattens and many others. But she already encountered the fact that people were stealing her ideas. So she began to patent her work. And probably if someone else was overseeing the business side of her work in the lampshade shop, she could have made enough money to protect those patents and keep her business going. So she rued that fact. So when she comes to New York, she starts to be an inventor again. She and Fabio are very poor. These invention drawings and ideas are on scraps of paper that they have around. They literally are that poor. They're using wrappers from things that they buy at the store and other scraps of paper to jot these things down. But she patents them all. And you can see that correspondence and that effort in all of these things. So she's inventing from a window washing arm for outside an apartment building in New York. She's designed clothing, sort of a spine straightener for women, and it comes with shoes that actually help with that. From a needle, that's a thermometer. She's still designing clothes and children's toys. So she's trying to market them to Saks Fifth Avenue, FAO Schwarz. She does sell Helena Rubinstein the patent for a lipstick case, which you can read about that letter here. But that was really the only successful placement she had. Again, in all things that she did, very ambitious. She's designing fabrics. She actually designed a plastic material that she thought she could be used for industrial design. Very thorough in those ambitions. Above them is the suite of drawings that I mentioned in the other gallery. So in the Philadelphia Museum, so again, because people like me have nothing better to do, when an artist is in a collection somewhere, you sort of have to root around because sometimes things are not properly labeled or they're not where you would think they would be. So the Levy papers in Philadelphia, but so is also the Ahrensburg collection. So in going through the archives at PMA, there was a suite of unidentified drawings in the Ahrensburg collection. I can't even remember how I came across them. It turned out it was a whole portfolio of Mina Lloyd drawings that they didn't know were Mina Lloyd drawings. And they were in the archive department, not in the art department. And so these drawings are the one immediate unresolved expressions of Mina's observation of the world, how she's looking at people, how she's observing different aspects of the human visage. Some of us see known people. The scholars yesterday were looking for known members of the avant-garde in this drawing. They have yet to be studied. There's more to the suite. This could, in fact, be Marcel Duchamp's profile. And this is the same actor or young man by two different views. And so it's exciting to see how she's seeing the world in them. And we don't know when they were made. So the fashion that's here could span the entire 60 years from when she's in Florence probably. So we have to have a fashion expert come and tell us what those clothing items are. Because it could have been a portfolio that she half filled and then did the rest of the pages when she was in New York. She found that pad of paper. So again, they're lovely. And again, for artists, the capacity to draw is often a very nurturing thing. So she had this facility, so it's an immediate way for her to be creative, affirm herself as a visual artist, and not necessarily have to deliver a final product. Work, like I said, the Degas things that she does for herself, just to nourish her thinking as a creator. So, wonderful. What's our time frame, Anne?
We're doing well. It's a little before 10:30.
Okay, and we have until when?
I think we should definitely head downstairs within about 15 minutes.
Okay, great, perfect. So right here is a very beautiful suite that I congratulate Anne for installing after I was gone. These pieces didn't come from the PMA. And it's a beautiful homage to the relationship that Mina had with Joseph Cornell. After Mina comes to New York, they become fast friends. And he is really her soul in her life, spiritual faith friend. There's avid correspondence between them about that. And they nurture each other. They send each other scraps of images, cut images, and phrases and things to nurture each other in their work. I think there's a whole doctoral dissertation that could happen here. But truly charming engagement between them. Joseph Cornell made this portrait box of Mina, utilizing this Man Ray image. And he's fragmented glass. Glass shards are in front of her face. Is that about the shattering of her? She's in a blue case, honoring the blue that he so admired in her work. We don't know what the reading of that is, but it's beautiful. In Insel, again, a tortured scholar, in Insel, which is her surrealist novel that wildly goes from fantasy to reality. She manages to weave in her own biography, her artwork, his artwork, a man named Richard Oltz, a painter, German painter, who's the other protagonist of the narrative. And they go on this sort of loopy journey together in the book. And there's one reference where she says that she gave to him another Cornell box, and she describes it in the novel. Do we know what Richard Oltz did get that from her? What did he do with it? He was a rather erratic character, but tragic that we don't have it, because it sounded very beautiful. So if you want to read the novel and find out about it. So after this period of painting, Mina then returns to cutout collage. In the mid-40s into 50, into the end of her life, she returns to cut paper as a medium. She begins to forage because she, like many artists, dumpster diving in the 70s was very popular in New York. It's a great way to find material to inspire you by. Young artists do it all the time now. The rest of the world's garbage can is your oyster. And so she begins to garner materials, fabric and paper, egg cartons, and fashions them into collages. She begins to figure out what she wants to do. As you move into this last body of work, which is for the Bodley exhibition in New York in 1959, in 1943, she moves to the Bowery. Do I have that right? And her daughters start a new chapter in their own lives there in Colorado. She's finally alone on the Bowery, and she's delighted. She doesn't care that she's living in a flop house. There's no one there to tell her what to do. And she fills up her apartment with this junk, and she just continues, she starts making art. And so this collage in particular, we don't know when it was made. It doesn't adhere tightly to the body of work from the Bowery, so it may have been something she began before. Again, inspired by Surrealism. This particular tower interests me. In the catalog, you'll see that Joseph Cornell sends her a copy of a project that he did that has an Italian tower to this profile in it. Also, too, in France, during the 30s, the Surrealists were all inspired by a park called Désirée de Retz that had a folly that looked like a collapsed column. And it still exists to this day in sort of a partial state. You can look it up online. That also could be the inspiration for this little castle. But anyway, kind of fun to see.
While we're standing in front of this piece, I love this work in part because it also sheds some light on new discoveries that have been made in the course of researching this exhibition. And as Jennifer mentioned, for me, one of the really fun things in watching this exhibition come together was thinking a little bit more about this relationship between Cornell and Loy. There's, as Jennifer was mentioning, a couple of wonderful pieces of correspondence with Cornell. And Cornell, of course, in his correspondence is really always making works of art. The piece on my left on blue paper is sort of fun because if you look at it, you'll see that you're invited to spin it around. And you're invited to see things in different orientations. And I think in many ways we see those concerns also reflected in this piece. And one of the fun things we came to learn about this work that opens up some new questions has to do with the orientation of this figure. So I hope everybody will enjoy diving into the catalog. And when you do, you'll see that in the catalog, this figure actually faces downward. As Roger mentioned last night, we were lucky to work with a woman named Rebecca Johnston at the Williamstown Art Conservation Center, who realized that actually the proper position of the piece is horizontally oriented. And we can actually see a line under the figure that confirms that orientation. And one of the things that I love about that is I think it helps us to remember that there's a way in Loy's work where she is really ready to reimagine things in new configurations, the ways that people are reimagined in clothing, or the way that a butterfly maybe come out of a cocoon. And then another thing, a couple of other conservators who are here with us, just to put this out on the table, thought that perhaps, and Jennifer was mentioning egg cartons and other materials, that there might also be a hint in this piece of the lampshades, that she may actually literally have been unfurling some of her lampshades here, or perhaps using fabric from them here. So again, this idea of metamorphosis that I think Jennifer has already touched on in her remarks is something that I just think is playing out in so many interesting ways here. And really, I think part of the fun of the work that Jennifer has done and the engagement with Roger and so many other scholars has been this opportunity to actually literally see these pieces anew. And so it's exciting to think about all of these wonderful discoveries.
Yeah, really good. So our last room here is the Bodley exhibition in 1959. So Mina's daughters, it becomes difficult to manage her life. They're funding her being on the Bowery. You'll see in the correspondence, they're trying to encourage each other to chip in a little bit more to pay for mom's red shoes or whatever. But they realize that they can't be comfortable with her being there alone in this community, even though she's very happy. So on a pretense, they invite her to Aspen, and she never returns to her life again. They close the door on her studio. She leaves a full body of work, which is the work that you see on this wall. And she's desperate for people to go and see it. She writes countless letters to people to say, please go see my work. I want it to be shown somewhere. This goes on for 5 or 6 years, and eventually Marcel Duchamp steps in, who was a fast friend of hers. That's a whole nother story we could tell you. But he steps in with Julian Levy, and they secure a relationship with the Bodley Gallery, which is a very well recognized gallery, a prominent gallery in New York at the time, showed Andy Warhol early and many other famous artists. And so they do an exhibition of Mina's paintings. Mina does not come to New York to the exhibition opening. While she, sort of said, why should I go? I've seen it already. Also in the correspondence, we know that the daughters wouldn't pay for it. It's too expensive for her to travel back. Or who knows what other motivations were there. But so her friends from the avant-garde, from Paris and everywhere, they all show up. So Robert Coates, Juna Barnes, everyone that admired her, Duchamp, all came to the opening in honor of her. And they saw through that she would achieve the William Copley Award for that exhibition. So at the end of her life, she's recognized for her art. She continues to make collage work in Aspen. That's the work on this last wall. So she starts collecting a new pile of garbage. When her daughters have to move her to a new apartment, they're like, what are we gonna do with all of this stuff? We have to move all of mom's garbage. But she continued to make work. She also, at the end of her life, was embraced by a younger cohort of poets, and her poetry was being reprinted again, including some new work. Here on the wall in the gallery, you can hear her voice, which is absolutely wonderful, and I encourage you to hear. She's interviewed late in her life in Aspen by Jonathan Williams, and was it Jonathan? Paul Blackburn, sorry. This is great. All right, I think we only have like 5 minutes or 10 minutes for questions, so I'd love to open it up to you all, and I or some of the other experts in the room can answer your questions.
Jennifer, I have a question. And thank you. This is for illuminating this fabulous exhibition. I was hoping you could speak about the title, which I love. Is that a phrase from Mina
Yes,
herself?
it is. So, and Roger found it in her work, and I think it was perfect for the show.
It's a line from an essay called Modern Poetry. But the title, it was a very interesting negotiation and, dialogue between the three of us and Jennifer and myself. And we've landed on that, I think, with real consensus. Before that, we had a lot of disagreement and difference. But finding titles are very important, but it's also very hard, I think, as you know.
Yes. Well done.
Yes, well done. Absolutely, it's perfect. So,
But do you think it's possible that some people might think that we invented that title? Just came up with it?
I
Did you assume
assume,
it
given
was
that Mina Loy was a writer, that it was a phrase that came from her. But what I like about it is that it suggests something about the wonder of life, but also the necessity of pragmatism. If you're a mother, if you're, so it's both. There's something sort of practical about it, but also wondrous. Yeah.
Nice comment.
yeah. And it continues to be applicable in terms of the embrace of her art, right? So what are some of the reasons that one of the reasons we don't know Mina Loy's art better is that she didn't fit into conventional categories, and she wasn't interested, while she had friends who were Dadaists or Surrealists or many other things, she was always autonomous. And so the work is continuing to float unhindered. So this is a wonderful time to see how it might be embraced now that people can see it again, at a time where I think Roger said aptly last night, perhaps this is now her moment. So artists, I'm a modern and contemporary scholar, and my experience has been in both cases that an artist who is an avant-garde, often when they're first making their work, it is not embraced because we can't approach it yet. We're not ready for it. We don't know how to look at it. We don't know how to articulate about it. And then the work goes forth in time, and if the work still is extant in the world, if the small group of fans take care of it, it has the chance to land in the future and sink at the time where it was a profit for, when it was made, and be embraced and recognized for how well it articulated the time in between and perhaps into the future. So that is what I think is an avant-garde. And I think Mina, what's that? Anybody else have a question?
Sorry, yeah.
Ma'am, were you going to raise your hand or no? Okay.
Last night, Roger, in your remarks, thinking about the objects on view, you raised the question of why Christ is hanging on a clothesline. And I just thought this might be a fun moment, perhaps, to think a little bit with Jennifer and with all of the other scholars about this question of why is Christ hanging on a clothesline?
Well, I think we have different opinions, right? I don't know if we do.
I'm here to listen.
Okay, we talked about it a little bit last night. So I actually think it's a really clear notion. So Christ is the Redeemer, and Mina is a Christian. She believes in redemption. She believes we all need to be redeemed. And so Christ becomes, his representation becomes, in the Bible, you know, as a servant, as Christ was lifted up on the cross, if you look to him, if anyone looks to him, they are saved. And so she puts him on a clothesline, and again, because that's my job, I did research in this period of what it meant. Was there any connection for people being hung on clotheslines? Well, yes, there was. So during the Depression, the homeless in the winter could give up like a penny or you got me going last night. What's the English equivalent? Pence. And they could pay to go into a warehouse at night with hundreds of other homeless people and be hung up to sleep on a clothesline. They would drape them over a rope to sleep, to make the most maximum packing of those bodies into that space to create warmth so they wouldn't freeze to death. And in the mornings, they would cut them down and kick them back out onto the street. So it was a slightly strange form of charity. It showed a modicum of benevolence, but it preserved life. So the hanging of a man on the clothesline is in fact that kind of salvation of the unredeemed, the street people of the world. My inference to this work, which I believe was made later. Again, so in this time, it's really interesting to look at these. Mina makes all these paper hands and faces. They become like the vocabulary for trying to make this next body of work. There are portfolios at Beinecke of like substitute faces. This particular character appears in many of them. There are 3 possible models for it. There was a Swedish fisherman who lived on the Bowery, who was a drunk, that she is spoken to. There's this young man, and there's Marcel Duchamp. So maybe all 3 of them come together to make this figure. The same poor street people, if they had 2 pennies, they could pay to be lined up in coffin-like boxes on the floor so they could lie down for the night in the same kind of warehouses. So this grid here, I don't know if it speaks to that. In fact, same other form of modest benevolence, but it's founded in that period and in that treatment of the homeless. So Christ being the Redeemer on the clothesline reads true to me in terms of those narratives. But that's just my contextualization. That's not, she never wrote that down. Yes?
I have an unrelated question that has to do with her seemingly lifelong interest in architecture and the spaces. And so I'm interested in actually these pieces here that are mounted on gray boards.
Yes.
And the question of, did she put those constructions on the gray boards, or was that later? And someone else asked the question about a lot of the frames too. How much did she have to do with the framing of these pieces versus
I'll
later?
answer and then Roger can answer more. So Roger actually mounted and framed these works here. So the gray board is his way to make them safe for presentation along with this glass. So the paper, the form that we see here is all we know that actually was. So that's those. The other frames in the exhibition, very few would Mina ever have had any connection to. The one frame that I pointed out for Wadsworth Atheneum, we know that in that exhibition, the show was exhibited in substantial, plain, all white frames, the entire show. So it was an installation. It wasn't just a presentation of individual paintings, it was actually a Gesamtkunstwerk. All of the Levy show. And those frames went away and they've just been framed modern way. I do think the early works from Florence, some of those are in fact original. She would have seen them and that's how she would have framed them. So anything to change any of that?
I agree with all that, yeah.
Okay. So actually Bowden took on quite a big responsibility in reframing a number of the works for presentation and for keeping them safe, which was a big commitment to this exhibition. So. Any other questions?
Jennifer, thank you so much for an amazing presentation of this material. We are so grateful to you for all of your work on this.